Well, hey there, everybody. Welcome to the Wednesday edition of A Daily Walk. If this is your first time joining us, you came on a good day. You say, why do you say that? Because we're starting a brand new study. Well, we just recently completed the book of Galatians, a letter written by the Apostle Paul, but now we're starting a brand new book. Do you know what it is? Drum roll, please. Okay, no drum roll. What are we starting? 1 Corinthians. That's right. You guessed it. Well, maybe you guessed it. 1 Corinthians. Let's open up our Bible, New Testament, 1 Corinthians chapter 1. How exciting. Well, I want to give you a little bit of background about this letter written to the church in Corinth. Of the 13 letters that the Apostle Paul had written that make up the majority of the New Testament, this letter right here to the Corinthians, it was probably the most difficult letter to write. And the reason why it was so difficult is that it was a letter of correction. We'll discover that the church in Corinth had many problems. They also had all the gifts of the Spirit in operation. They had great teachers come through, but they were carnal. They had got tripped up and they were divided. And so Paul is just writing line upon line, correcting them in the areas where they needed to be corrected. But just a little bit of background about how this church got started in Corinth. If you know anything about ancient Corinth, you'll know that it was a place that was famous for economic blessing. And the reason is because of the location. Where Corinth was located, it was on this isthmus. And the isthmus was in a place where the sea trade could come through, merchant ships would come through and connect to Corinth. And because of its location, it made it economically prosperous. I mean, they had a lot of money coming through this commercial area of Corinth, somewhat of a metropolitan area, just with a lot of money being produced. But in addition to being economically solid, they also were very into philosophy. Of course, with the Greek culture, the Hellenistic culture that surrounded them, philosophy was flourishing. And they were very fond of rhetoric and speeches and words being spoken very eloquently. In fact, they would say that if a person spoke in a particular manner, philosophically, that they spoke with a, quote, Corinthian style. So there was a style of speaking that was well known and applauded and welcomed in that philosophical arena. But they also were known for their sporting events. There were two sporting events in ancient Greece, in that culture of Greece, I should say. One was the Olympic Games that we still participate in today, but then there was something called the Isthmian Games. And it would take place right there in Corinth, and people would come from every direction to compete there in that region, made it a very popular destination. But for all of its economic wealth, its philosophical wisdom, and its competitive nature of that culture, there was something else that was there that made it rather dark. And that was their fascination and pursuit of false gods. There was an Acropolis, a large mountain there in Corinth. And on top of that mountain was a temple that was dedicated to the false goddess Aphrodite. And that temple, there were temple prostitutes who would come down into the city and seek to draw away merchants and so forth to worship this false goddess in the most sexually perverse ways. It was a very dark city. It was culturally acceptable, and people just were engaged in it. People would travel to Corinth for that purpose, to go up onto that hill and to worship there. Sad. But Paul the Apostle came into this city. Acts chapter 18 records it, and he met a couple. Their names were Aquila and Priscilla. And Paul, along with this dynamic couple, had the same trade, the same job. That is, they made tents. And so they would work in the city during the day making tents, and then they would be evangelizing on their off time. And they started to see the Spirit of God began to work. In fact, Paul ended up spending 18 months in Corinth ministering there. And it was from Corinth that he actually wrote his letter to the Romans that we have in the scriptures, and his letter to the Ephesians. He wrote it from the city of Corinth. Several years ago, I was in the city of Corinth. Of course, it looks nothing like it did during Paul's day. But I walked through the remains of the city, which were all ruins. And the interesting thing that dawned on me is as you walk through the city, you can imagine where the tent makers would be set up in the marketplace. I walked through the old marketplace, the road still being there. And as you make your way through, you look up and you can see the Acropolis, where the temple would have been housed. But this is something else that was quite amazing. Check this out. It's all ruined. There's nothing left of it. This incredible Acropolis that housed these temple priestesses, it's gone. The place that was affluent and merchants would dwell and make their money and come, it's all gone. And I'll never forget when I was walking through Corinth and seeing all of this, it dawned on me. This is what happens to the people, to the nation, to the person who turns his or her back on God. Your life just becomes nothing but ruins. There's nothing left. You're just walking through overgrown shrubs and pieces of rock that used to house all kinds of wealthy individuals and idolatrous persons. It was pretty eye-opening for me. So it was from here that Paul was able to establish a church. And the church, well, it started out well. They had a lot of great things going for it. God was working in this area, but there was also a lot of warfare. And the church began to drift away from the foundation that Paul had established. And now, well, he was forced to write a letter of correction, a difficult letter to write. And so we open very quickly in the first verse. Paul, called to be an apostle of Jesus Christ through the will of God, and Sosthenes, our brother. What do we know? The first thing we understand from this letter to the Corinthians is that it was written by Paul. He puts his name right at the beginning. And we also find out not only his name, but what his calling was. He was called to be an apostle. The word apostle means one who is sent to represent another. Paul was called to be an apostle. How? By the will of God. And he could say that. I am Paul the apostle by the will of God. This is God's will for my life. This was God's calling on Paul's life. Friend, did you know that God has a calling on your life? And that you should be able to say today your name and be able to say, I am whoever I am by the will of God. This is God's will for my life. I pray that as we start this study through the book of 1 Corinthians, that we would receive everything that the Lord has for us, and that we would learn what it is to walk with the Lord and be in his will instead of our own. We'll look forward to getting deeper into this letter tomorrow. God bless you.